You know how it is, life throws curveballs, right? And sometimes you need a little extra help, maybe take out a loan.
Yeah, happens to everyone. Car breaks down, unexpected bill.
Exactly. On a personal level, we kind of get that. But when you zoom out, look at the national level, the numbers, they
Hmm.
just become, wow.
Mind-boggling, really.
We're talking about average American credit card debt around, what, $5,300 and total U.S. household debt over $17 trillion.
It's huge. It really shows how much borrowing is part of the system at all levels.
And it makes you think about the anxieties we feel managing our own debt, right? The interest piling up, the repayment pressure.
And those same anxieties, they get mirrored, but on this massive, much more complex scale when we talk about countries in financial trouble, exploring those parallels is, well, pretty fascinating.
Which leads us straight into this really crucial and honestly kind of scary idea, the debt spiral.
Ah,
That
yeah.
situation where you end up borrowing money just to pay off the debts you already have, it just sounds like digging a deeper hole, doesn't it?
It absolutely can be.
Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, he put it pretty bluntly. He said something like, while debt has its uses, when debt is used to pay interest on other debts, we're dealing with a financial pyramid that will sooner or later collapse.
That's a stark warning. It really hits at the core issue of sustainability. You know,
Mhm.
can anyone, an individual or a whole nation, just keep borrowing forever to service old debt?
Probably not. And applying that to global finance, the potential fallout is enormous.
Exactly.
Which brings us right to our main topic today, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
Hmm.
When a country hits really hard times, economically speaking, and turns to the IMF for a loan, is that a lifeline? Is it that crucial helping hand in a crisis?
Or is it something else?
Or could it be, like some argue, a more complicated deal, maybe even a trap that leads to more problems down the road?
That's the fundamental tension we're diving into. What's the IMF's intended role versus its actual impact? It's a huge question.
It really is. So over the next while, we're going to dig into the IMF's history, how it's structured, how it actually works today.
How it all came about, yeah.
And we'll definitely look at some of the big criticisms people have about its practices. Plus, we'll examine some real-world examples of countries that took IMF loans and what actually happened.
You really need both sides, right? The goals they started with and the reality on the ground.
And the sheer scale of IMF involvement is just staggering. Since the early 90s, something like 100 countries have gone to the IMF for help.
100 countries. Wow.
And right now, a record 94 countries still have outstanding debts. The total, an incredible $130 billion.
That's a massive reliance on one organization. It really underscores the IMF's central role and influence in the global financial system.
Okay, and here's where it gets even more interesting, I think. We're going to try and uncover some of the less maybe well-known parts of how the IMF operates.
The behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, things like pushing for privatization of state companies, forcing cuts to social programs, even, and this is fascinating, actively promoting central bank digital currencies.
CBDCs, right. That's a whole other layer.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the gap between the IMF's official goals and what countries actually experience when they sign on the dotted line.
Exactly. And our main guide for this deep dive is the book How the IMF Manipulates Countries, The Invisible Hand of the Market by Michael Rodriguez. So let's get started. Let's unpack what Rodriguez puts forward.
Let's do it. And right away, Rodriguez offers a pretty critical view of the IMF.
He really does. He argues that many experts don't see the IMF relationship as just a simple rescue mission. They see it more as a potential debt trap.
A trap, yeah.
And he argues this can lead to some really serious negative outcomes for the countries involved. Things like being forced to sell off key national industries, losing control over their own economic path.
It definitely pushes you to look at the IMF with a more critical eye,
Yeah,
to question the standard narrative.
definitely. Now, to really get the IMF, the book takes us back, way back,
Mm.
to the economic chaos of the early 20th century.
Right, the context is key.
We're talking the huge costs and upheaval of World War I, and then, of course, the absolute devastation of the Great Depression.
You see, the IMF didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was a direct response to these massive global economic shocks. There's real desire to stop that kind of thing from happening again.
Absolutely. World War I alone, the cost was something like $280 billion in today's money for the countries fighting, and it completely wrecked the old gold standard system, leading to massive inflation. Germany, for instance, prices quadrupled by 1918.
And Keynes himself pointed out back then, those harsh reparations demanded from Germany in the Versailles Treaty, they just made things worse economically.
Then you had that brief boom, the Roaring Twenties, right?
Yeah.
But bam, 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression hits. Unemployment just skyrockets, like 25% in the U.S., 30% in Germany. Global trade just collapsed.
It was truly global. And everyone throwing up tariffs, protectionism, that actually deepened the crisis. It showed how interconnected things were, even then.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, World War II. The economic destruction, especially in places like the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, just unbelievable. Infrastructure flattened.
Total devastation in many parts of the world.
But here's the striking contrast the book points out. The U.S. economy actually doubled in size during the war.
That massive economic difference post-war. It was hugely important in shaping the balance of power and, crucially, how the IMF was designed and how it operated later on.
The book then gives these really vivid examples of hyperinflation, that terrifying situation where money just becomes worthless practically overnight.
It's hard to even imagine.
Hungary after World War II. Prices were doubling every 15 hours. 15 hours.
Yes.
They had a banknote with the 21 zeros on it.
21 zeros. That's just astronomical. And those stories from Germany, a loaf of bread costing 200 billion marks, people literally burning money for heat because it was cheaper than firewood.
Right. Someone steals your basket but leaves the cash because the basket's worth more. It shows a complete societal breakdown.
Absolutely. Money loses all meaning.
So all this chaos, this economic nightmare, sets the stage for the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The book calls it the birthplace of the IMF.
And you had these key figures there, John Maynard Keynes from Britain, Harry Dexter White from the U.S. They had very different ideas for what the post-war financial system should look like.
Competing visions.
Yeah. Keynes wanted something maybe more balanced, where creditor nations, the ones with surpluses, also had a responsibility for global stability. But White's plan, which put the U.S. dollar right at the center of everything, well, that's the one that won out.
And so the IMF was born, along with its sister institution, the World Bank. Now, the official goal sounded pretty good, right?
On paper, yes. Very ambitious.
Promote international monetary cooperation, boost trade, keep exchange rates stable, create a system for international payments, and, crucially, offer temporary financial help to countries struggling with their balance of payments.
It was definitely an attempt to learn from the failures of the 20s and 30s, build something more stable through cooperation.
Okay, structure-wise, there's a board of governors, an executive board, HQ in Washington, D.C., big staff, big budget. But here's a detail you might not know. The loans they give out, they aren't usually in dollars or euros. They use something called SDRs.
Special drawing rights. Yeah, that's important to understand. Think of it like the IMF's own internal currency almost, an international reserve asset. Its value is based on a basket of major currencies.
Exactly. And right now, that basket is heavily weighted toward the US dollar and the euro. So those currencies have a lot of sway.
Which gives the U.S. and Europe significant influence.
Right. Keynes had wanted this unit based on gold, but that didn't fly. And it's important to remember, SDRs aren't like physical cash you can spend anywhere. Their use is a bit limited. A country can't just take SDRs and say, build an airport directly.
Right. It's more about shoring up their international reserves, dealing with those payment imbalances, stabilizing things in the short to medium term.
Okay, now let's talk interest rates. How much does it cost to borrow from the IMF?
Well, the base rate is calculated from the interest rates on government bonds in several major economies. Right now, early 2024, it's around 4%.
4%? Doesn't sound too bad, maybe.
But the book really stresses this point. That's just the base rate. There are other fees layered on top.
Like what?
Service fees, commitment fees for money they've promised but haven't disbursed yet, and significantly, extra surcharges if the loan is very large or outstanding for a long time.
So it adds up.
It really can. The book quotes Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who basically says these often overlooked fees can effectively double the real interest rate a country pays, especially for those already in deep financial trouble.
Wow, doubling the rate. That's quite a difference from the headline number, and a major point of criticism, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's a key part of the argument against the IMF's lending practices, the true cost of borrowing.
Okay, let's shift gears and look at some specific countries the book uses as examples. First up, surprisingly maybe, is France.
France?
Yeah. France was the very first country to get an IMF loan, way back in 1947. Post-World War II devastation, right? Buildings destroyed, farmland unusable, infrastructure wrecked, lots of inflation.
Makes sense they'd need help. How much did they get?
$125 million from the IMF. But here's the thing the book highlights. Compare that to the U.S. Marshall Plan aid France got.
Which was much bigger, wasn't it?
Way bigger, like $2.5 billion. So the book uses this to show that, IMF aid might be one thing, but other forms of assistance, often with political goals tied in, can be much larger. Barry Eichengreen is quoted saying the Marshall Plan was also about containing communism.
Right. So international finance is rarely just about the economics. There are always geopolitical layers.
Definitely. And speaking of geopolitics, the book then discusses the Soviet Union. They decided not to join the IMF initially.
Why not?
A couple of big reasons. One, members had to contribute 10% of their gold reserves. For the Soviets, post-war, that was a huge ask.
They needed that gold themselves.
Probably. And second, the IMF demanded full economic transparency. For a centrally planned economy, in the emerging Cold War, that was seen as a major security risk. Letting the West see all their economic data? No way.
Understandable from their perspective. Did they try to negotiate?
Yeah, apparently there were talks, but they broke down. The book mentions Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, basically saying the USSR had a special position and couldn't meet the IMF's terms. It's interesting because Roosevelt had apparently wanted the Soviets involved.
But the ideological divide, the different economic systems, just too wide by then.
Seems so. The book then briefly mentions other IMF loans in the 50s and 60s, Britain during the Suez Crisis, Italy, France again after the '68 unrest. It notes these loans often came with conditions and sometimes led to economic downturns or social tension.
And this period also saw the IMF create the extended fund facility, right, for longer-term problems.
Exactly. So the IMF was already expanding its role beyond just short-term fixes, though the book questions how effective or positive these longer interventions always were. Then we jump forward to a really pivotal moment, Russia joining the IMF in 1992.
After the Soviet Union collapsed. A chaotic time.
Totally chaotic. The book paints a grim picture. Hyperinflation, GDP collapsing, industry grinding to a halt, incomes plummeting, huge budget deficit, hardly any foreign reserves left, just dire.
So they turned to the IMF.
They did, and got significant loans. But the conditions attached, well, they were the classic IMF package. Rapid economic liberalization, super tight money supply, mass privatization.
The shock therapy approach.
Exactly. And the book argues, quoting Joseph Stiglitz again, that this period was an economic catastrophe for Russia. Many ordinary people suffered immensely.
It's often cited as a prime example of, let's say, the potential negative consequences of these rapid IMF-driven reforms.
Which brings us to Argentina. This is a case the book explores in really extensive detail. It's portrayed as a particularly stark example of IMF involvement maybe going wrong.
Argentina's had a long and troubled history with the IMF, hasn't it?
Extremely long. The book notes Argentina was once quite wealthy, but then went through decline and became heavily reliant on IMF loans, especially between 1989 and 2001. Borrowed $57 billion in that period alone.
$57 billion. Huge amount. And what reforms did they implement?
The full neoliberal playbook, according to the book. Fixed exchange rate, pegging the peso to the dollar, massive privatization drive, opened up trade, deregulated finance, slashed social spending.
And the results?
Pretty devastating, Rodriguez argues. Unemployment shot up, poverty soared, and crucially, the country's debt just kept getting bigger and bigger.
So the loans didn't fix the underlying problems?
It seems not. The book really uses Argentina to illustrate that core argument about the debt trap. Repeated borrowing cycles, harsh conditions. It seemed to make things worse, not better.
A vicious cycle.
Exactly. And it all came crashing down in 2001, a massive default.
What triggered it?
A perfect storm, really. Huge amounts of money fleeing the country. The government imposed really severe austerity, including freezing people's bank accounts, the famous Corralito.
I remember that. People couldn't access their own savings.
Terrible. Led to massive protests, social chaos. And then the IMF decided not to provide any more money.
Pulled the plug.
Right. And the default that followed. The economic and social fallout was just catastrophic. And the book points out, even today, 2024, Argentina is still grappling with huge IMF debt, still facing massive inflation, high poverty, still negotiating new deals with new conditions.
Decades later, still caught in it. The book quotes someone, Claudio Luisardi, calling it debt bondage.
Yeah, pretty powerful term. It really raises questions about the long-term impact of these programs.
A very sobering case study.
Another really compelling example the book digs into is Greece, 2015.
Ah, the Eurozone crisis.
Right. Greece technically defaulted on an IMF payment. It came out they'd been, well, fudging their budget numbers for
Playing
years,
to the books.
pretty much. So to get these massive bailout packages from the Troika, that's the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission, Greece had to swallow incredibly harsh austerity medicine.
I remember the headlines. What kind of measures are we talking about?
Deep cuts to government spending, slashing minimum wages and pensions, raising the retirement age, hiking taxes, selling off state assets. A really drastic program.
And the human cost. The book must cover that.
It does. Georgios Argyros is quoted comparing the IMF's prescriptions to medieval bloodletting,
Yeah.
just sucking the life out of the economy.
Wow. That's harsh. What were the results?
Terrible. GDP collapsed. Unemployment went through the roof, especially for young people. There was a tragic rise in suicides, a wave of emigration, poverty levels shot up.
Just devastating social consequences.
Absolutely. When Greece missed its IMF payment, they went into arrears. Further aid was stopped. The Greek banks nearly collapsed, leading to capital controls limits on withdrawing money.
Similar to Argentina's Corralito, in a way.
Similar effect, yeah. There was some talk about debt write-offs like Haiti got after the earthquake, but the book notes any new help still came with very strict conditions.
So even in a crisis like that, the fundamental approach didn't really change.
Seems not.
Finally, the book highlights Argentina again, but in 2018, they received a loan of $57 billion.
Another massive one for Argentina.
It was actually the largest single loan the IMF had ever given out, even bigger than the Greek bailouts.
The largest ever. Why so big?
Well, the book suggests it actually exceeded the IMF's own lending rules and claims this happened partly due to political pressure from the U.S.
Interesting. So politics playing a role again.
Seems likely. And just to give a snapshot, as of early 2024, the book lists the top 5 IMF debtors as Argentina, Ukraine, Egypt, Ecuador, and Pakistan. And that total outstanding IMF debt hit a record $131 billion.
So more countries owing more money than ever before. That tells a story in itself.
It really does. Okay, so having laid out these examples, Michael Rodriguez really gets into his main analysis, his critique of the IMF. And it's pretty damning.
He doesn't pull any punches, does he?
Not at all. He argues the IMF, far from helping, often acts in ways that actually make debt crises worse, and that it leads to countries losing control over their own destiny, their national sovereignty.
So challenging that image of the IMF as this neutral technical body, he's saying his actions have real, often negative political and economic consequences.
Exactly. One of his big criticisms centers on how the IMF is governed. The quota system, the voting power.
Right. It's not one country, one vote.
Not even close. He points out that the U.S. and other wealthy Western nations have vastly disproportionate voting power. The U.S. basically has a veto over major IMF decisions.
Which leads to accusations that it serves their interests primarily.
Precisely. The book quotes economist Donny Roderick suggesting the IMF can effectively become an instrument of U.S. foreign policy.
That's a serious charge. It raises questions about fairness and whose agenda is really being pushed.
Then the book digs into a major scandal from 1998 involving Russia. Remember those big loans Russia got just before its economy collapsed and defaulted?
Vaguely, yeah. What happened?
Well, the book alleges that billions of dollars of that IMF money basically vanished, disappeared into offshore bank accounts.
Billions. Just gone.
Apparently. And there was supposedly a cover-up attempt, including the dismissal of Russia's prosecutor general who was investigating it.
That sounds incredibly corrupt.
The book cites the New York Times and even the U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time, Robert Rubin, raising questions about where the money went. A former Russian government advisor, Sergei Glaziev, is quoted alleging a conspiracy behind the capital flight and the impact of the default on ordinary Russians. Devastating.
That kind of scandal must have severely damaged the IMF's reputation for accountability.
You'd think so. And the book argues the controversies didn't stop there. It mentions the scandals involving 2 former IMF managing directors.
Strauss-Kahn and Lagarde, right?
Yeah. Dominique Strauss-Kahn faced those very serious allegations in New York. And Christine Lagarde, while she was managing director, was actually convicted back in France for negligence relating to a financial case from when she was France's finance minister.
Those high-profile cases certainly don't help the IMF's image. Even if they involve the individuals, it reflects on the institution.
True. And more recently, 2021, there was that data manipulation scandal. This involved Kristalina Georgieva, the current IMF head, but it happened when she was at the World Bank.
What was that about?
She was accused of pressuring World Bank staff to basically fudge the numbers to improve China's ranking in the influential Doing Business report.
Seriously, manipulating data.
That was the allegation from an independent investigation. The Economist magazine called for her resignation. Paul Romer, a former World Bank chief economist, talked about how damaging it was to trust in their data.
Wow. That really undermines the idea of these institutions providing objective analysis.
The book uses it as more evidence that these bodies aren't immune to political pressures.
It certainly feeds that narrative.
Now, interestingly, Russia actually paid back all its IMF debt by 2005. Seemed like they were trying to break free, gain more economic independence.
Right.
But then, fast forward to 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia tried to access its own SDRs, its reserves held at the IMF. The IMF said no, blocked access due to the international sanctions. Economist Kenneth Rogoff is quoted commenting on how this showed the IMF becoming increasingly politicized.
So SDRs aren't automatically accessible, even if they technically belong to the country. Politics trump the rules there.
It appears so. This leads the book into discussing the Washington Consensus. Heard of that?
Yeah, it's that standard package of free market policies the IMF, World Bank, U.S. Treasury supposedly pushed on developing countries, right?
Exactly. Privatization, liberalization, deregulation, fiscal discipline. The book lists the 10 main points, and it hammers home the criticism that this one-size-fits-all approach often had really negative results.
Critics argue it ignored local conditions and benefited corporations or creditors more than the actual countries.
Right. Stiglitz is quoted again saying the IMF often represents creditor interests over debtor needs. The book even links the intellectual roots of this consensus to U.S. university economics departments and mentions the American advisors involved in Russia's messy privatization in the 90s.
Which, as we discussed, didn't end well for many Russians.
No. Rodriguez also makes the case that the IMF has historically been biased towards Europe.
How so?
He points out that until 2019, every single IMF managing director had been European. Plus, a lot of the early lending and the huge bailouts during the Eurozone crisis went to European countries.
And the euro being included in the SDR currency basket.
That too. He contrasts this perceived bias with the IMF's current, maybe overly optimistic forecasts for Europe's economy, despite challenges like falling production and high debt.
So, questioning whether the IMF is truly global or still has a European focus, it adds to that critique of neutrality.
Then the book looks at potential alternatives. It talks about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others.
As a counterweight to the Western-dominated institutions.
Exactly. Specifically, the creation of the New Development Bank, or NDB. It's presented as an IMF World Bank analog, but with different principles.
Like what?
More equal voting, one member, one vote. Supposedly, no political conditions attached to loans, a focus on funding infrastructure, and using national currencies, not just the dollar.
Sounds different, but is it as big or influential as the IMF?
No, the book acknowledges the NDB is much smaller. Its capacity is limited compared to the IMF. But it also discusses China's own massive lending, especially through its Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, China's become a huge global lender independently.
Yes, but with its own set of practices and criticisms. The book notes Chinese loans are often less transparent, might not have overt political conditions, but often require using Chinese contractors or demand collateral like ports or mines.
Which leads to accusations of debt trap diplomacy, right? Like that port in Sri Lanka.
Exactly. The Hambantota port example is mentioned. China ended up taking control of it when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans used to build it. So the book suggests that while different from the IMF, Chinese lending carries its own significant risks.
So maybe just swapping one set of problems for another.
That's the question the book leaves you with. Okay, one last major point Rodriguez raises is the IMF's recent push for central bank digital currencies. CBDCs.
Ah, yes. Digital money issued by central banks. The IMF is promoting this.
Actively. Kristalina Georgieva is quoted talking about the need for a global platform for CBDCs. The book outlines the supposed benefits, efficiency, financial inclusion.
But it's always a but.
But it also details the serious risks and concerns critics have. Big concerns.
Like what?
Lots of privacy, potential for total government control over your money, the possibility of programmable money, where the state could dictate what you can or can't spend it on.
That sounds dystopian, like your money could expire or you could be blocked from buying certain things.
Exactly. Or funds being easily confiscated. Plus risks of centralization. What if the whole system gets hacked? Kenneth Rogoff and Daryl Duffy are quoted raising some of these red flags. China's digital yuan, the ECNY, is mentioned as an early example already in use.
So the IMF promoting this technology globally.
Uh,
The book sees that as potentially problematic.
Very much so. It ties into the broader theme of control and potential loss of freedom associated with these powerful international institutions.
A worrying potential future for finance.
Definitely food for thought. So, wrapping up the book's arguments, the core message is that relying on IMF help is risky. Countries can get trapped in debt, and the austerity medicine often prescribed actually harms development in the long run.
Using examples like Argentina, Zambia, Ukraine as evidence of these long-term negative cycles. Robert Wade is quoted talking about the road to eternal debt bondage.
Yeah. And again, the author poses that critical question, would BRICS or China becoming the dominant lenders really be any better? It's left open.
A complex picture with no easy answers.
For sure. So for anyone listening who wants to really dive deep into all this, explore the arguments and the evidence presented, well, the recommendation is clear.
Michael Rodriguez's book, How the IMF Manipulates Countries, The Invisible Hand of the Market.
Absolutely. I would highly recommend this book to anyone interested in global economics, finance, and international relations. It is not just an academic analysis. It is a practical guide to understanding the hidden mechanisms that determine the economic fate of entire countries.
It definitely gives you a strong critical viewpoint to consider. It's a perspective on a hugely powerful institution that really does shape the lives of millions, even billions of people.
So, bringing our discussion to a close then, this deep dive has really highlighted that core tension surrounding the IMF, hasn't it?
It really has. Savior or maybe enslaver. Lifeline or debt trap.
Exactly. It's incredibly complex, and the consequences of these IMF programs, as the book argues, can be profound and last for generations.
And often devastating for ordinary people caught in the middle of these huge macroeconomic adjustments.
The book we focused on, Rodriguez's work, definitely presents a critical case arguing the IMF structure, its ideology, maybe prioritizes creditors, the lenders, over the debtors, the borrowers.
Which naturally leads you to think about the future, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Does the global financial system need reform? Do we need different kinds of institutions? Are there other ways for countries to develop without getting caught in these cycles?
It really makes you think of that Keynes quote, you know? Something about shaping the future or being shaped by it. We have choices to make.
Indeed. And looking at the history of the IMF, the successes, the failures, the controversies, it offers some big lessons, systemic lessons about power, about money, and about how ideas and institutions impact real people all over the world.
Ultimately, the future of the IMF, the future of global finance, it's not just for economists or politicians to worry about. It affects all of us. It reminds me of what Ha-Joon Chang said. Economics is too important to leave to economists.
A perfect thought to end on. It's something everyone should be thinking about.